A groom tries to publicly humiliate his ex at his wedding, but her shocking revelation turns the entire celebration into a moment of truth that no one saw coming. The golden light of the morning sun poured gently through the tall glass windows, wrapping the grand wedding hall in a soft, glowing warmth. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above, scattering reflections across polished marble floors. Every detail was perfect, the white roses arranged delicately on each table, the soft music floating through the air, and the quiet laughter of guests dressed in their finest. It looked like a dream. The kind of wedding people imagine their whole lives. Guests smiled, cameras flashed, and whispers of admiration filled the room as everyone waited for the ceremony to begin. On the surface, everything felt calm, joyful, almost magical. But beneath that beauty, something felt different. There was a tension, subtle, invisible, yet undeniable. Like a quiet storm waiting to break. At the center of it all stood the groom. Dressed in an elegant suit, he greeted guests with a confident smile, shaking hands, exchanging polite words. To anyone watching, he looked like a man completely in control of his big day. His posture was straight, his voice steady, his smile almost perfect. Almost. Because if you looked closely, just for a moment, you could see something else hiding behind that smile. A flicker in his eyes. Something colder. Sharper. As if his mind wasn't fully present in the celebration around him, but focused on something else entirely. Today, everything will change. He adjusted his cufflinks slowly, glancing across the room, not at the decorations, not at the stage, but at the crowd. Searching. Waiting. Why did he seem so certain, so prepared? A group of guests laughed nearby, completely unaware. The bride's family chatted happily, their excitement pure and genuine. Even the bride, somewhere behind closed doors, was getting ready for the happiest moment of her life. But the groom. He wasn't just waiting for the ceremony. He was waiting for something else. Something planned. Something intentional. The music shifted slightly, signaling that the ceremony would begin soon. Guests began to take their seats, their voices softening into a gentle hum of anticipation. Phones were raised, ready to capture every beautiful moment. And yet, the groom's eyes moved again. Scanning. Calculating. For a brief second, his smile faded, just enough to reveal the truth beneath it. This wasn't just a wedding for him. It was something more. Something deeper. Something dangerous. What could possibly turn such a perfect day into something else entirely? As he took his position near the stage, his lips curved again into that practiced smile. But now, it felt different. Not warm, not joyful, but certain. Like a man who knew exactly what was about to happen. And as the doors slowly prepared to open, and the entire hall held its breath, the tension grew heavier. Because sometimes, the most beautiful moments hide the darkest intentions. The soft melody of wedding music drifted through the hall as guests settled into their seats, their attention slowly turning toward the stage. The atmosphere felt calm, almost peaceful, like the quiet pause before something beautiful begins. The groom stood confidently, greeting a few final guests, his smile steady and controlled. But then, something shifted. His eyes stopped. Just for a second. Across the room, near the back row, sat a woman dressed simply, almost as if she didn't want to be noticed. Her posture was calm, her face composed, her gaze lowered slightly as if she wished to disappear into the crowd. But she couldn't. Not today. Because he had seen her. His ex. The air around him seemed to freeze, even as the rest of the hall carried on, unaware. The faint smile on his lips slowly faded, replaced by something sharper, something colder. Something unfinished. His jaw tightened, and his fingers curled slightly at his side. For a brief moment, the confident groom vanished, revealing a man holding onto something he had never truly let go of. So, she actually came. His eyes didn't move away from her. Not even for a second. Memories rushed back without warning, moments of love, promises whispered in quiet nights, laughter that once felt endless. And then the pain. The betrayal. The silence that followed. All of it came crashing back in an instant. She hadn't changed much. There was still a quiet strength in her presence, still that calmness that once drew him in. But today she seemed different, stronger somehow. As if time had healed her in ways he never expected. And that bothered him. Why did she look so unaffected? So at peace? A flicker of irritation crossed his face, quickly hidden behind a polite expression as a guest approached him. He nodded, smiled, responded, but his mind wasn't there anymore. It was with her. Watching her. Questioning her presence. Why would she come to this place, on this day? Was it curiosity? Regret? Or something else entirely? The music grew slightly louder, signaling that the ceremony would begin soon. Guests leaned forward in anticipation, unaware of the silent storm forming between two people across the room. The groom inhaled slowly, regaining his posture, fixing his suit as if preparing for something more than just a wedding. Because now, this day meant something different. This wasn't just about love anymore. It was about control. It was about closure. Or maybe, something darker. His eyes narrowed just slightly as he looked at her again, a faint, almost invisible smirk forming at the corner of his lips. Whatever peace she carried into that room, it wasn't going to last. Because in that moment, a decision had already been made. And she had no idea what was coming next. The sound of soft music and distant chatter slowly faded, as if the present moment was slipping away. And in its place, the past returned. It began with something simple. A memory of laughter. Sunlight falling across a quiet cafe, where two people sat across from each other, smiling like the world outside didn't exist. Her eyes sparkled with warmth, and his voice carried a softness that only she could bring out of him. Back then, everything felt easy. Natural. Real. They were happy. Truly happy. Long walks, late-night conversations, dreams shared without fear, every moment stitched them closer together. He once held her hand like it was the only thing that mattered. She once trusted him like he would never let her fall. We were perfect, weren't we? But perfection rarely lasts. The warmth of those memories slowly darkened. Smiles turned into silence. Conversations became arguments. The same words that once healed began to hurt. There were misunderstandings, small at first, almost harmless. But they grew. Doubts crept in quietly, like shadows stretching across something once bright. He became distant, guarded. She became confused, trying to hold on to something she could feel slipping away. Then came the night that changed everything. The air was heavy with tension, words hanging unspoken between them. She stood there, her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. He looked away, unable or unwilling to meet her gaze. And then, the truth surfaced. Not gently, not kindly, but in a way that shattered everything at once. Accusations. Betrayal. A mistake that could not be undone, or perhaps a truth that had been hidden too long. The details blurred, but the pain remained clear. Her voice trembled as she asked questions he couldn't answer. His silence said more than any words ever could. How do you fix something that's already broken beyond repair? That night ended without closure. Without peace. Just distance. She walked away with a heart full of unanswered questions. He stayed behind, holding on to anger instead of regret. And from that moment, everything changed. Back in the present, the groom's expression tightened as the memories faded. The echo of the past still lingered in his eyes, in the tension of his jaw, in the way his gaze refused to soften when it returned to her. Because what once was love had turned into something else. Something heavier. Something unresolved. And as the wedding hall filled again with sound and movement, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about a past relationship. This was about wounds that never truly healed. The music softened as the ceremony reached its most delicate moment. All eyes were on the stage, waiting for the vows, for the promises, for the beginning of a new life. The bride stood there, glowing in white, her hands gently clasped, her eyes filled with emotion. This was supposed to be her moment. Their moment. The groom stepped forward, taking a slow breath as he reached for the microphone. At first, it seemed normal, expected even. A few heartfelt words, perhaps a romantic speech. But something in his expression felt different. Too controlled. Too certain. The room fell completely silent as he lifted the mic, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. For a brief second he paused, his eyes locking onto someone in the distance. Her. A faint, almost unnoticeable smirk appeared on his lips. This is where everything changes. Before we continue, he began, his voice calm but carrying an unusual weight, there's someone here I'd like to invite on stage. A soft murmur spread through the guests. Confused glances, raised eyebrows. This wasn't part of the ceremony. The bride's smile faltered slightly, her fingers tightening just a little. The groom didn't hesitate. He called her name. And just like that, the entire atmosphere shifted. Every head turned toward the back of the hall. There she was. His ex. Sitting quietly just moments ago, now frozen under the weight of hundreds of eyes. For a second, she didn't move. It felt unreal, like the ground beneath her had suddenly disappeared. What was he doing? The silence grew heavier. Slowly, she stood up. Not in fear, but in quiet confusion. Her steps were measured, calm, even as whispers followed her every move. The distance to the stage felt longer than it should have. And when she finally stood in front of him, the tension became unbearable. The groom looked at her, not with warmth, not with nostalgia, but with something sharp. Something deliberate. He let out a soft laugh, shaking his head slightly as if amused by the moment. "I think everyone here deserves to know the truth," he said, his voice louder now, cutting through the silence. The bride's face paled. The guests leaned forward. And then, he began. Word after word, he painted a picture of the past, but not the whole truth. Only the parts that made her look guilty. Accusations wrapped in confidence. Half-truths spoken like facts. Each sentence felt heavier than the last. Gasps echoed softly around the room. The bride looked between them, her confusion turning into discomfort, her joy slowly fading into something else entirely. And the ex. She stood there, listening. Not interrupting. Not reacting the way everyone expected. Her face remained calm, but her eyes held something deeper. Stronger. The groom's voice grew sharper, almost triumphant, as if he believed he had already won. But in that moment, something felt off. Because while he was speaking louder, she was becoming stiller. And sometimes, silence speaks louder than humiliation. The room held its breath. Because this wasn't just a speech anymore. This was something else entirely. Something no one could stop. A heavy silence filled the hall for a moment, and then it broke. Whispers began to spread like a wave, moving from one table to another. Guests leaned closer to each other, exchanging confused looks, their voices low but filled with judgment and curiosity. Some watched with shock, others with disbelief, and a few with quiet agreement. The groom stood firm, gripping the microphone, his voice steady as he continued. Each word he spoke sounded more like a performance than a confession, carefully chosen to shape the story in his favor. And the crowd was listening. "She doesn't deserve sympathy," he said, his tone sharp, almost convincing. "People should know who she really is." A few heads nodded. Others frowned. But no one stopped him. The bride, standing just beside him, felt the shift more deeply than anyone else. Her smile had completely disappeared now, replaced by uncertainty. Her eyes moved between the groom and the woman standing in front of them, trying to understand what was happening. This wasn't the moment she had imagined. This wasn't the man she thought she knew. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a small step back, as if creating distance from something she didn't recognize anymore. "Why does this feel so wrong, on the happiest day of my life?" The whispers grew louder. Some guests began to judge openly now, soft sighs, raised brows, subtle shakes of the head directed toward the ex. It was as if the groom's words had already begun to shape their perception. And yet, not everyone was convinced. A few eyes lingered on her. Watching. Waiting. Because something about her didn't match the accusations. She stood there, still calm, still composed. No anger, no panic, no desperate attempt to defend herself. Just silence. And that silence made people uneasy. If she was guilty, why wasn't she reacting? If his words were true, why did they feel incomplete? The groom continued, his voice rising slightly now, feeding off the attention, the reactions, the control he seemed to hold over the room. But control is fragile. And sometimes, it begins to crack when you least expect it. The bride's breathing grew heavier. Her eyes softened, not with understanding, but with doubt. Doubt about him. Doubt about everything. The celebration had completely vanished. In its place stood confusion, discomfort, and something much deeper. Fear. What kind of truth begins like this? The air felt suffocating now, every second stretching longer than it should. No music. No laughter. Just tension hanging thick between every heartbeat. And in the center of it all, the ex remained still, unshaken, as if she knew something no one else did, as if she was waiting, not to defend herself, but for the right moment to speak. The room felt heavy, as if every breath carried the weight of what had just been said. All eyes were still on her, waiting, expecting her to break, to cry, to defend herself in panic. But she didn't. She stood there, calm and still, her posture straight, her expression composed. The noise around her, the whispers, the judgment, the tension, seemed to fade into the background. For a moment, she said nothing. And that silence was powerful. The groom watched her closely, a faint smirk still resting on his lips, as if he believed this was the end of her story. But it wasn't. Slowly she lifted her gaze, her eyes meeting his, not with anger, not with pain, but with clarity. A quiet strength that no one had expected. This ends today. She took a small step forward, her voice soft but steady as she spoke for the first time. Can I say something? The simplicity of her question caught everyone off guard. The groom hesitated for just a second. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. Still confident in his control, he let out a small laugh and gestured toward the microphone. Go ahead, he said, his tone almost dismissive. The microphone passed into her hands. And suddenly, everything shifted. The whispers stopped. The room fell silent again. Because now, it was her turn. She held the mic gently, taking a slow breath, not to calm herself, but to gather the truth she had carried for so long. Her eyes moved briefly across the crowd, then rested on the bride. There was no hatred in her gaze. Only honesty. I didn't come here to create a scene, she began, her voice clear, steady enough to reach every corner of the room. I came quietly, because I believed the past was already over. A pause. Her words settled into the silence. But since my name has been brought into this, I think the truth deserves to be heard. The groom's smile tightened slightly. Something in her tone had changed the atmosphere. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't emotional. She was certain. The crowd leaned in, listening more carefully now, not to judge, but to understand. Even the bride took a step closer, her eyes searching for something real, something honest. The ex didn't rush her words. She let each sentence breathe, each moment carry its weight. Because this wasn't about proving herself. It was about revealing what had been hidden. Her calmness made every accusation feel weaker. Her silence between words made the truth feel heavier. And for the first time since this began, the groom looked uncertain. Just for a second. Just enough to notice. Because sometimes, the strongest response isn't anger. It's control. And in that moment, she had taken it back. The room wasn't watching a victim anymore. They were watching someone who knew exactly what she was about to say next. The silence in the hall deepened, as if the walls themselves were waiting. She stood there, holding the microphone, not tightly, not nervously, but with quiet certainty. Her eyes moved once more toward the groom, and for the first time he looked away. That small moment did not go unnoticed. She took a breath. And then she began. You told everyone I betrayed you, she said, her voice calm, steady, impossible to ignore. But you never told them why everything ended. A ripple moved through the crowd. The groom shifted slightly, his jaw tightening. She continued. You didn't tell them about the nights you disappeared, the calls you ignored, the promises you broke long before I ever walked away. Her words were not loud, but they were sharp. Each one landed with quiet precision. The whispers began again, but this time, they sounded different. Uncertain. Curious. Should I stop here? She paused for a second, her gaze steady. Or should I tell them the truth you've been hiding? The question hung in the air. The groom stepped forward quickly, his voice cutting in. This is not necessary. But she didn't stop. Because this moment belonged to her now. No more silence. You wanted to humiliate me, she said softly, but you forgot something. She turned slightly, her eyes now meeting the bride's. I stayed silent to protect someone. The room froze. A single sentence, and everything changed. The bride's expression shifted instantly, confusion turning into fear. "What does that mean?" someone whispered from the crowd. The ex didn't rush. She let the weight of her words settle before speaking again. "I found out the truth before I left," she continued, her voice unwavering. "Not about me, but about him." The groom's face lost its color. For the first time, the confidence he carried all day cracked. "He wasn't just lying to me," she said. "He was living a double life." Gasps echoed across the hall. The bride took a step back, her hand slowly covering her mouth. The groom shook his head, trying to interrupt, but his voice felt weaker now, uncertain, defensive. "That's not." But the crowd was no longer listening to him. They were listening to her. "I saw the messages," she said. "The meetings. The truth he thought no one would ever find out." Her eyes didn't leave him. "You didn't just betray me," she added quietly, "you betrayed everyone who trusted you." The silence that followed was louder than anything before. The groom stood there, frozen, exposed, his carefully built image collapsing in front of everyone. And the crowd had turned. No more whispers of judgment toward her. Now, all eyes were on him. Disbelief. Disappointment. Shock. The bride's eyes filled with tears, not from confusion anymore, but from realization. The truth had been revealed. And it had changed everything. Because sometimes, the person who tries to destroy your name is hiding the truth that will destroy theirs. The silence that followed her revelation hung in the hall like a storm cloud ready to burst. Every guest sat frozen, some unable to believe what they had just heard, others whispering urgently to the person next to them. The air was thick with shock, disbelief, and tension that seemed almost tangible. The bride stepped back slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she tried to process the truth that had just unraveled before her eyes. Her carefully prepared happiness now felt fragile, fragile enough to shatter in an instant. How could everything I believed be wrong in just a few words? She thought, her heart racing with confusion and sorrow. The groom, once so confident, now looked smaller, exposed. His carefully constructed image had crumbled, leaving behind only shame and regret. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. Around them, the crowd began to stir. Guests whispered, pointed, some shook their heads in disappointment, others in disbelief. A few moved closer, trying to understand what had just happened. The carefully planned celebration had dissolved into chaos. The bride turned slowly, her eyes meeting the ex's. There was no malice in that look, only a mix of hurt, clarity, and newfound understanding. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Actions carried the weight of. With quiet dignity, she took a step back, lifted her chin, and walked away from the stage, leaving everything behind: the expectations, the heartbreak, the deception. And the ex? She followed her own path, not hurried, not dramatic, simply composed. She held herself with quiet strength as she moved past the stunned crowd. Each step was measured, each breath steady. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The truth she had spoken had already done its work. The groom stood frozen, abandoned by both the bride and the approval of those around him. His voice, once commanding, was now lost in the murmurs of judgment and whispers of disbelief. For the first time that day, he felt the consequences of his actions fully, unmistakably, and completely. Outside the hall, the sunlight was soft and forgiving. It fell gently on the departing figures, illuminating the truth that had been hidden for too long. The ex and the bride walked away in silence, carrying different paths but sharing one lesson: integrity and courage are stronger than deceit and manipulation. The guests slowly began to recover, some offering quiet nods of respect toward the ex, others reflecting on the lessons they had just witnessed. This wasn't the wedding they expected, but perhaps it was a wedding they would never forget. Because some truths are too important to ignore, and some lessons too powerful to forget. Moral: truth may shake the world around you, but it always sets the heart free.